the political time horizon is quite short. And so as a company, the position that we take, and you may find this surprising, we don't advocate for policies that benefit our company per se. We advocate for the right kind of policies associated with our industry that we think is best for society.
Darren Woods, thanks very much for joining us here and for agreeing to be on this episode of the Leaders Podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. It's good to be here.
Yeah, great to see you again. So you've been CEO for 8 years. Mm-hmm. It's been a pretty tumultuous 8 years. The oil price has gone from, less than $30 a barrel to over $120 a barrel. You led through a pandemic. You had to divest $3 or $4 billion in Russian assets. You had an activist attack on your entire board, and you operate in this increasingly polarized environment where a substantial group of people think that what you do is evil, and a substantial group of people think that climate change is a hoax. And I guess the question I want to start with is, yeah, you sighed at that. That's your 8 years. The question I want to...
I just didn't like the summary, Alan.
You didn't? Well, you're free to question the summary. I guess my question is, what, from your perspective, what has been the greatest challenge of the last 8 years for you?
Well, you certainly had the highlight reels in terms of a lot of the challenges that we faced as a company and that I faced in this job. Actually, I think one of the advantages of growing up in this company is we've always focused on the fundamentals. You know, we make investments and decisions that span decades into the future. There's always a significant uncertainty. We invest all around the world and in a number of different countries and regimes. And so uncertainty is, I think, basically built into the business and how we make decisions. And over the years, the decades that I've been involved in this company, the way we manage that uncertainty is to stick to the fundamentals. And so we spent a lot of time as a company trying to, as best as possible, objectively assess what's happening in the world, what are the macro trends, what do we see, societal trends, demand, policy, technology evolution, to get a picture of the world relevant to our business and where that's going. And then we base our decisions on those fundamentals. And many of the challenges that you highlighted here in the intro are a function of sticking to those fundamentals rather than going with the existing popular narrative that's out there. And I would say at a very high level, that's the essence of the challenge of, frankly, doing this job for this company, is continuing to set a course and focus on what we believe to be the fundamentals, recognize and understand the moment you're in, what's happening, the current narrative, continually assess whether something's changed in those fundamentals. But to the extent we conclude nothing's changed, you stay on course. That's, I would say, has been job number one. And it's a tough thing to do, to stand out in the crowd and stick to the fundamentals that you've developed. The other thing which I was adamant in this job is, stick to your knitting. Understand what your core competencies are, where your competitive advantages are, focus on those advantages, and then look to see how best you can leverage those to meet the demands of society.
Which means you didn't chase after batteries or solar panels or other sources of energy during the period when that was the thing to do.
Yeah, actually, and we were part of the problem in referring to ourselves as an energy company. People made the extension, well, if you're an energy company, then you should go into wind and solar because that's going to be the new form of energy. And really, as I thought about it, and frankly, the narrative that we've been trying to put out with the company is we're not an energy company per se. We're a company that transforms molecules, hydrogen and carbon molecules. We have a very large chemical business, one of the largest in the world, that has nothing to do with energy, but instead all the products that make modern life possible. That often gets glossed over. And what we do as a company is grounded in the technology of manipulating and transforming hydrogen and carbon molecules. Now, a vast amount of our product goes into energy products and combustion of those, but those products and those sectors don't define us as a company.
So you would say your course over those 8 years has been pretty steady and stable, and the challenge has been the winds that have buffeted you in different directions.
Absolutely. You can go back in time. In fact, I've had many employees talk to me about this, that the things that I talked about internally, the way we talked about running the business and where we wanted to put our emphasis has been very, very consistent year after year after year. We've just really focused on getting better at what we do, differentiating ourselves more from our competition, and then applying those advantages to the opportunities to help meet the world's needs. You know, as large as we are as a company, we represent roughly 3, maybe 4% of the global oil and gas markets. So we've always seen ourselves as being driven by the world's demands and their needs, not the other way around. And so it's just a question of what does the world need and what can we do to help meet those needs.
You are, though, a regulated industry. You can't ignore the political winds or the regulatory winds or the tax and subsidy changes. I mean, how have you, and I don't think I've covered American government for 4 decades. I've never seen a swing as great as the one that happened in the last election, particularly with regard to your industry. How do you deal with that kind of a swing?
Well, it comes back to the fundamentals and the horizon that we think about our business. If you think about from the time we find an opportunity to execute and then start that opportunity up, which is typically an asset that we invest in, the time from that can be anywhere from 8 to 10 years. And so when you look at the decisions that we have to make, the life of those investments, which go for decades into the future, the political time horizon is quite short. And so as a company, the position that we take, and you may find this surprising, we don't advocate for policies that benefit our company per se. We advocate for the right kind of policies associated with our industry that we think is best for society. The philosophy being that if you're a company that's going to be around for the next 50 to 100 years, you need to be successful in the context of what's good for society and where communities benefit from what you do. And so we constantly are advocating what we think is best for society. And then the challenge we have as a company is find a way to be successful in what's best for society.
Well, that's a great pivot. Let's talk about that. What is best for society at this moment in time? I read your sustainability report. You think 2050, the world will maybe have a 25% reduction in
emissions.
In emissions. Mm-hmm. That's far short of the goal. How long do you think it will take us to get to goal, and what are the costs of not getting to goal?
Well, I guess the only way I can answer that question is when do we think the right kind of policy will come in place to drive markets to solutions rather than assign accountability to companies. You know, what I would tell you is the big challenge that we have in this space is very early on that the challenge of addressing emissions was defined by a very narrow group of ideologues that landed on a very narrow set of solutions. And actually the objective statement, which I'm sure started out as let's reduce emissions, eliminate emissions, quickly translated into get rid of oil and gas. We lost sight, the society lost sight of the objective statement, which was emissions. And so that then led to a drive to figure out how you throw out what society's been working on and investing in over the last 150 years to what was a very effective and productive energy source to try to replace that with the new source. And frankly, from our perspective, we have no, personally I view we should be moving where it's economically viable to wind and solar. But there are many places where it's not. And where it's not, we should continue to use existing energy sources, but focus on decarbonizing those. We are missing a huge opportunity today by not trying to decarbonize what we already have in place.
Yeah, so that's what I want to talk about, because I'm trying to take my lead from you. Say, okay, we're not going to talk about the political ideologues on both sides of you these days. Let's talk about your mission, which is to do what's right for society. when it comes to the climate at this moment in time, what is right for society? How do you balance the costs of decarbonizing against the costs of not decarbonizing? I mean, you have a better scientific eye on that than I do, certainly, and probably most people at this table. So give us your best analysis, leaving the political ideology aside, of what the right course for society is.
So what's good for society is to continue to provide the energy that the world needs desperately to grow, that economies need to grow, and that people need to improve their living standards. If what often gets forgotten is half the world's population today lives in energy poverty. That has to be addressed in some way, and it has to be affordable, and it has to be reliable. And so economies are going to grow. And so as you look at the need to continue to improve people's prosperity all around and grow economies, you're going to need energy. Energy, you can't do it without energy. And so that's a fundamental that we have to, as a society, address. At the same time, we have to find a way to decarbonize and reduce the emissions associated with today's energy system. And so we have to do both of those things. It's the and equation. You mentioned the word cost. One of the challenges with the approach taken today is there is no accounting for cost. And actually, one of the things, if you step back and think about what does the world need to do to effectively decarbonize what we have while we work to find new solutions to what we want, you need a mechanism for accounting for carbon. The thing that I find astounding is the world has quickly adopted this view of net zero by 2050, and yet we have no mechanism today to accurately account for the carbon or to develop a carbon intensity at a product level. So what products does society needs? What's the carbon footprint of those products, and what can we do to try to change that?
Are we moving in the right direction?
We've got to get, step one is the world has got to align on some mechanism for accounting for the carbon.
And what are you doing, what can you do as the CEO of Exxon to make that happen?
So the principle that I bring to the advocacy we do around the world is take the experience that I personally have had in this industry, but more importantly that our company has had over 140 plus years of being in the industry, and provide the perspective and experience and knowledge to policymakers to make the decision. This carbon accounting and then carbon intensity calculations for products and then carbon intensity specifications on product, there are a lot of analogies in our space where that's been used to successfully improve the environmental impact of the products that we serve. The greatest example that I would point to is desulfurization of diesel, taking sulfur out of diesel. That was driven by product specifications, and the markets figured out how best to meet those specifications. We could do the same thing with carbon intensity on products and start to decarbonize the existing transportation fleet all around the world while we work to build the EV fleet and potentially replace the internal combustion engine.
Are you doing that internally? Do you have effective carbon accounting in place in Exxon?
We have been quite vocal in engaging cross-industry. This is not an energy industry thing. This is a cross-industry, economy-wide thing. And I've been out talking to a number of different groups to put that proposal out there. And I've been surprised at how it's resonated with businesses all across different industries. And so we're standing up, working as one of the sponsors, along with many others, to stand up a coalition to try to put together an expert panel that will, just like we did GAP many, many years ago, to define how best to account for carbon across the world, and to do that on an international basis. So once you've established a carbon accounting framework, you can then begin to look at the products that drive the most emissions, and then governments can begin to kind of put carbon intensity.
Wasn't there something like this back before the Great Recession, kind of 2006, 2007, U.S. cap that was attempting to do the same thing?
The trading, yeah. That's a little different in terms of looking at trying to cap the amount of emissions. What we're trying to do is to get to product level specifications and manage this at the product level level. The reason for that is it gets the government out of the business of deciding how to achieve an objective, allows them to focus on the objective they want achieved, and then it lets the market, the companies, the businesses that participate in that market, drive to meet that specification, and it unlocks innovation. It challenges me to be more competitive.
Creates a market.
And find ways to get better at it than you, so that I get an advantage and I generate a return for that. And that's ultimately what's going to be needed is some mechanism that generates returns for investments in this space.
And you sound kind of optimistic about this.
I think the idea, given that we've pressure tested this with a very broad group of academics, think tanks, and businesses all around the world and have gotten a very, very positive response, I think conceptually there's a lot of power in the idea. I don't discount the difficulty of making it happen, but
do you have to have government to make it happen?
the governments will have to be involved, absolutely, because ultimately they will have to buy into the fact that you're going to regulate through this mechanism. So I admit that it will be hard, but whoever thought that trying to change the existing energy infrastructure all around the world was going to be easy? This is very much tied into the fundamentals, and from my perspective, irrespective of how you think, what solution you think is needed out there, it's hard to argue with establishing a mechanism that's globally accepted for how you account for the carbon that you're trying to eliminate.
Have you, and in the meantime, in this changing political environment, have you backed off of any of the commitments you had in place a year ago? Are your 2050 internal commitments the same? Are the investments you were going to make under the IRA the same? Has any of that changed?
So I think one thing, we don't make pledges, we do plans. And the targets that we've laid out there, or the plans that we've put in place, are through 2030, and those plans haven't changed. So the drive to reduce our emission intensity of the products that we make are in place. We continue to make very good progress, and we're on track to get to net zero in the Permian. One of the things we wanted to demonstrate is in the unconventional space, which is one of our largest and fastest growing areas of our business, that we can produce oil and gas and decarbonize the production of that oil and gas at the same time. And so we have a net zero pledge there, and we're actually making progress on that, and nothing's changed. Once we put in the plan, we stick to it.
So you say it's not your strategy to chase the electron business, but it is to deal with molecules, and that has led you to focus on carbon capture and particularly storage, and it's led you to focus on hydrogen. Where do you think we are in those technologies, and how big a part of the solution can they be?
So I think carbon capture and storage has to be an essential part of the solution set, but it's got a ways to go to be applicable to a broader range of emissions. Today, with today's technology, carbon capture basically works economically at the kind of incentives that are out there today for high concentration CO2 streams. As streams become more and more dilute, that technology becomes more and more expensive. So there needs to be advances in technology. There are many companies working on those advances.
Including yours.
Including us and many others, which is exactly what we want and need. And I think, over time, and the position I always take is, up until the need to capture CO2 for emissions reductions, there was no incentive to improve the technology to work at low concentration. That incentive now exists, and so we're just starting that technology on that technology journey and curve. So I'm very optimistic that somewhere somebody will find ways to continue to improve the cost of that, lower those costs, and that technology will be more broadly applicable. And I think that's going to happen over time. Just in the short term I've been in this job, it went from, in the early days, people telling me that carbon capture is not real, to today, people acknowledging that carbon capture is one part of the solution, and I would readily admit that it is one part of the solution.
How about hydrogen?
Hydrogen, I think, is more challenging just because of the cost associated with it. So we, as part of the IRA, one of the, I think, really important parts of the U.S. legislation was that it was geared towards, and incentives were tiered on carbon intensity, which we thought was very important. So don't specify technology, specify the objective, which is carbon intensity. We've developed a project that can achieve those very high levels of carbon intensity reductions. Big challenge that we have there, we're not interested in a project that just works under the IRA. We're interested in a project that helps catalyze the establishment of an industry, of a new market. And one of the challenges with what the changes to the IRA is they've shortened the time those incentives are available. And so one question in our mind is there still enough time to establish enough of a base to get this market up and running? And that's a really important question that we have to answer. And then the other big challenge is it's still expensive even with the incentives provided by the US government. And so other governments that support the customers have to provide incentives. and those are slow to come. And so right now, we're working on getting offtake for customers, and that's the second part of the equation that has to come together before we'll advance that project.
In your estimation, again, going back to Exxon's mission is to do what's right for society, how much time do we have to solve this?
I think, I don't know the answer to that question. What I do know is we've been slow to make progress to date because we've been so narrowly focused, and we're trying to open up the aperture so that more solutions are being advanced in parallel rather than doing it in series. And just to be clear, when we say we do what's right for society, our view is governments are elected to kind of define that. Then our job is to be successful with that and then find a way to how we can contribute to
But governments aren't doing their job. I mean, how, as a leader, you have to deal with the fact that they aren't. When you go from
when I start getting elected by the people, I'll start representing the people. That's the big challenge that we have today.
You have control of a pretty big pool of assets.
And so we're working to take those assets and think through how best we can contribute to what the society is demanding of us, where the demand is at. But ultimately, that demand has to manifest itself in market returns.
And how long do you think we have for that to happen?
I do not know the answer. I don't know the answer to that.
Do you have a sense?
I don't have a sense. I don't know. I don't think that anybody actually does. I think it's clear to me that the emissions that have been society's producing through the use of fuel systems around the world, that is impacting the climate and warming.
So we don't have an infinite amount of time.
So but how that goes forward, I think, there's a lot of debates back and forth. I don't have a clear view of that. Our position on it is we kind of like what we've got today, so let's work to keep it. And so try to bring the solutions forward. And what you'll see with my advocacy and what I do publicly is I feel my role in this is to be very vocal and explicit and to make sure that we don't try to cater to the current narrative, but instead try to be explicit about what we see as the challenges and what the opportunities are. And to the extent we can influence people and their thinking and start to shift the narrative and the emphasis in areas, then we're trying to do that as a company. That's what we see as part of our job.
You talk about the focus on the topic of the moment. The topic of the moment is AI and its voracious energy appetite. I mean, what we're talking about is a massive challenge, would have been a massive challenge before AI popped on the scene, and now we're seeing huge numbers of additional energy demand. How does that impact the equation in your view?
It makes it harder. It makes it that much harder. I think the advantage of data centers, and we actually, because we've built a value chain for carbon capture and storage, in fact, we're uniquely positioned. I think we're the only company today that has the ability to capture, transport, and store, and we have within the company the capability set and core competencies to do all those. We have a very large project organization. We understand subsurface and reservoir management, so we understand the side of the sequestration and storing the carbon underground. We understand the technology for capturing it. So we've got all the pieces. We put that together in a business, and now we're working to drive that business forward and generate returns and reduce emissions. And today, as a company, we've got contracted 10 million tons per annum of third-party emissions that we're going to capture and store.
Contracted with the emitters.
With the emitters.
And then you sell credits to the big tech companies? I mean, where's the revenue stream?
So we sequester that CO2, and the incentives provided by the IRA and provide the incentives to make those investments to the companies. And then for the data centers, where you've got this challenge now, if you look at the big challenge with the data centers is huge amounts of increased additional demand and needed in a very short time frame. And so when you put those two things together, the size of the problem and the urgency of the problem today, there are essentially no real solutions other than power generation with natural gas. What we're offering up as a company with this unique end-to-end capacity is we can offer sites and help build those data centers with power generation on natural gas, capture the emissions and sequester it so that we can provide low carbon data centers, removing about 90% plus of the carbon to help solve the emissions associated with this short-term need and demand, meet the time scale that the developers, the hyperscalers need, and also address the emissions challenge. Yeah. So we're uniquely positioned to do that. We're in discussions today to try to establish that.
I want to pivot a little bit. This podcast is called Leaders. There was a 6-month brilliant branding effort that came to.
Congratulations.
It's true. And so I want to ask you some questions about your leadership, but I think the first thing I'd like to ask you is what is the one thing you wish somebody had told you 8 years ago before you dove into this?
I think probably the most unique aspect of this job that, frankly, through my development, I've been with the company for 33 years, and in that time I've had 20 jobs, 11 different moves. The company invested a lot to help me see and experience different parts of the business and the challenges associated with that business all over the world. The one unique thing in that context about this job is the board and the interaction with the board and how that manages. And I think from my perspective, stepping into this job, that was probably the most alien aspect of understanding how that dynamic works. And you've got independent people that aren't familiar with your company, aren't familiar with core competencies, aren't familiar with a lot of things that frankly, growing up in the company, you take for granted. And so understanding how best to navigate that environment and make sure that people are all on the same page is probably the one area that would have been a lot more helpful.
You had a little bit of a rough start, but seem to be doing it very well right now. Any advice you would give to other CEOs who have to deal with boards? Any lessons you can boil down for them?
I think if you talk to the people that work for me, work with me, I like transparency. I actually think I have this saying I've used as I've come up in my career, none of us are as smart as all of us. And so really take the opportunity to engage whatever room or meeting that you're in, the best thinking of the group, and make sure that ideas are being challenged. I always told people as I've come up through the company, the riskiest decisions we make are the ones that we all agree on, because you don't have the debates, you don't have the different perspectives. And so at the board level, I tried to bring that same dynamic to bear and actually leverage the capability set, the outside perspective, the very diverse experience that we have on the board to pressure test the things that we're doing and to challenge the way we think. And that, I think, helps us as a business and the management team that participate in those discussions, but it also creates a very dynamic, a positive dynamic in the room where people feel like they're contributing and really getting to understand the issues, and it brings the group together more closely. In fact, you mentioned some of the outside directors that came in. They spent several months really aggressively challenging the way our thinking, the plans that we put together, the strategy, and at the end of that process, fully endorsed what we had planned to do in our strategy.
And it made you better.
Well, what it did was it gave the rest of the board confidence that you had somebody come in that was looking for opportunities to make the company better, and the end result of that process was to endorse the plans that we had in place. And so that, I think, really grew the confidence, brought the board together.
A lot of people who would like lessons in that, in mastering that challenge. What would you say is, in the last 8 years, the biggest mistake you've made as CEO?
Probably overestimating the external world's focus on the fundamentals. I think
their rationality, maybe.
The basics of I tell people take the climate for the example. One of the things I say is we don't need pledges. We need plans. People need to start doing the math. I mean, these things we've got to get out of the world of what we'd like to do and start figuring out what we can do and how are we going to do it. And so I think that's been I've gotten more and more vocal in that space, that we've got to start building plans, and I didn't appreciate maybe the need to do that earlier.
Yeah. How would you describe your leadership style?
Straightforward.
Straightforward. You said transparency. and where did you learn it? Did you learn it in Exxon? Did you learn it did you have an early leadership mentor? Where did that focus on transparency come from?
So over the course of my life, I've moved 22 times. I've grown up all over the world, on average, moved every 2 years. And over that, when you're a kid and going through those teenage years, it's really difficult to move on a constant basis. And I think through that process, at least for me personally, it got to a stage of whether you either try to fit in everywhere you go and adjust, or you establish your own set of values and principles and you live by them irrespective of what environment you find yourself in. That's a harder path to go down, but I think over time, builds a level of confidence, and that was the path that I chose. And then I joined this company who gave me a huge opportunity to grow and to develop and to put me in different jobs, working with different people. And so I would tell you, I learned through hands-on experience. That's one of the great things about this company is we like to give young people big jobs early in their career and challenge them to be successful. And then we try to find your limits. We try to find every individual's limit. And so I would say through the course of my career, I kept getting bigger jobs, more responsibility, harder challenges with the view that says, let's see you step up and do that. And so through the course of that, that's where leadership came, and I learned from the people around me. I learned from the people who worked for me, the people I worked with, and those that I worked for. So it's hard to point to any one individual. I would say it was the collection.
Yeah.
But it is
22 times, though. Is that before you joined Exxon?
No, that's in total. That's over the course of my life. I've moved 11 times over the course of my 33 years with the company.
It's hard on the family.
Yeah, it's really hard on the family. In fact, it's interesting because I grew up that way and I hated it. And I told my dad I would never do to my kids what he did to me.
And you did.
And I did. Exactly that. And I did it, though, because when I got out of college, I realized how fortunate I had been to actually see a large part of the world and live overseas. And I just felt like that was an incredible experience, a very enriching one. So I told my kids from very early, this will be difficult. There will be times in your life when you will find this very hard, but I promise you, you will reach a stage in your life and you will look back on this and be glad you had it. And I'm quite pleased today that all my kids, I have three of them, they all will tell me that they are glad they had the experience.
And did you tell them stick to your principles, be who you are, even in the midst of a changed environment?
I tried to help give them some of the things that I learned along the way, and they've all, I think, lived up to that in different ways. But I'm quite proud of all three of them.
When we talked a couple of years ago, you told me one of your principles was never do anything you wouldn't want your mother to read about on the front page of the newspaper. Mm-hmm. Have you been able to stick to that one pretty well?
Absolutely, for sure. I'm. That is to me, and we grew up in the company like that. That was the first advice I got in my very first job with the company.
Yeah.
If you're doing something you'd be embarrassed for your mom to read about, stop doing it.
Yeah.
And the other piece of advice from the same manager was, you got to get up and look yourself in the mirror every morning, make sure you like what you see. And I think those are very easy. I mean, I think when you think about that, that's a simple formula to live by.
How long are you going to do this?
That's a good question. I don't know.
It's not totally up to you, I get. But
no, it's not totally up to me.
There has been some recent research. There's a book out recently called The Life Cycle of the CEO that says CEOs do their best after the 10th year.
Well, don't let my board read that. I think if you look, we've got some, we've been on a transformation journey. We got a number of things that are continuing. They're in the pipeline, continuing to develop. So I think I've got several good years still left in me and lots of things to do.
A few quick questions before I let you go, kind of a speed round. What kind of car do you drive? Do you drive electric, hybrid, gas?
Gas.
Okay. What kind of music do you listen to? Classical, rock, country?
Country.
Good man. Your preferred water bottle, is it plastic or is it recyclable?
I have a pet peeve about water bottles. I drink out of the tap, actually.
Good man. And when the job really gets to you, there got to be times, given the tumult that you have operated in, I appreciate your steadiness. When the job really gets to you, what do you do to cool down? Do you meditate? Do you take a walk? Do you drink Tennessee whiskey? I mean, what's your preferred?
Yes.
All of the above.
No, I keep a very bright line between my family and work. I don't bring work home. It's been a rule that I had. In fact, I don't think my kids could ever tell you what I did up until I got this job. They still don't know what I do, but at least they know the title. So I actually find that separation allows me to go home and with my wife or with my kids fall back into a routine that is completely oblivious of anything that's happening at work. That is a huge benefit to what I do, and so it's really anchored in being with my family and them not focusing on the job. They don't ask me what I do at work. They don't ask me how the day went. We get into what they're doing and what's happening in life in general. And having 5 grandkids now, adds a whole new dynamic that allows you to get very distracted very quickly.
Good for you. Darren Woods, thank you very much for being on Leaders.
Thank you, Alan. It's good talking with you.